Good morning. It is hard for me to believe that it is July already. I don't know if any of you all feel that way, but I feel like school just ended and, we should be much earlier in the summer. Though school really did just end, I guess, for some of you. Sorry about the snow days. But yeah, it feels like things are just going so fast. And it was really now a month ago that my youngest sister graduated from high school. And yeah, that's her. Not the tiny little one. She would be a child prodigy or something. The one with the cap. And she graduated, and being at her graduation was sort of a surreal experience for me because I was back in the same place that I had been 13 years before. And a lot of the stuff was the same colors, same for the most part music. Though they have changed a few traditions. They rewrote the alma mater to a tune that is now moderately singable, and somehow the administration figured out how to get parents and family members to stop ringing cowbells when their kids would go across the stage. Now, Carroll County. Yep, it's a Carroll County thing. But there is one tradition that still hasn't died out in her high school, at least, and that's the tradition of senior superlatives. You all familiar with that? Yeah. Well, if you're not familiar with what it is, it's where members of the graduating class vote for one another for whom among them is going to receive titles like Best Smile, Best Hair, Best Car, Class Clown. Though I was talking to my sister about this, and it sounds like they've made some adjustments to the list over the last few years to make it a little bit more interesting. So now they're voting for things like who's most likely to win Jeopardy? Who's most likely to appear on a reality TV show? Most likely to survive the Hunger Games? But one of the superlatives that a lot of schools, including hers, have cut from the list is the title most likely to succeed, out of concern that it might put too much pressure on the recipients. But title or not, I think any of us who've grown up in America have at one point or another felt a pressure to be successful, to make something of ourselves, to go out after high school, after college, whatever it is, and do something great. And there's this increasing pressure on teenagers to be the student with the highest test scores, the highest GPA, the most AP classes, the most extracurricular activities. And all of this is focused on helping them get into the best college. Because there's this illusion that the students who attend the best colleges are the students who end up with the best jobs. And so because of that pressure, there's now levels of anxiety being reported among elementary school students that far exceed anything people have ever seen. And we're now doing poorly means getting a B. Yeah. And so in a poll of teenagers ages 13 to 18 in this past decade, 8 out of 10 of them believed that success was important no matter what the cost. And that same study revealed that feeling didn't really go away after college and once they entered the workforce. So now there's something that's being called a quarter-life crisis. Yeah, we've got our midlife crisis, but now there's a quarter-life crisis, and it's something that people in their 20s and early 30s experience when they discover that their relationships, their jobs, their finances are not what they expected them to be. And so from the time we are born, we're essentially taught that the only way for us to go in life is up. And a lot of us, if we've been out of school for a while, maybe even if we're retired, we might not feel that same level of pressure that we once did. But if we examine our lives on a day-to-day basis, I think many of us are going to find that there's this subconscious expectation that our lives should be on some sort of trajectory toward better, bigger, faster, more stylish, whatever it is. When we sit, we find our imaginations drifting toward what's next on the horizon. Whether it's our homes, our careers, our education, how we're known by others. And there's a name, there's a term for this type of advancement or betterment of our lives. And that term is upward mobility. And as I was reflecting, I think it's a very appropriate time to reflect on this, being Independence Day weekend. What I realized is that the potential for upward mobility has more or less, for many people, become synonymous with the American dream, even if that's not quite what our founding fathers had intended. And so now, with the goal of upward mobility driving our society, we end up doing things where we compare ourselves to other people. I don't know, I see a couple people nodding that this happens. Well, anyone who is on social media is guilty of this. I don't know if you've been on Facebook or LinkedIn, and I don't know how many of you have spent some time kind of browsing the pages of your former classmates or coworkers or neighbors, and quietly comparing your life to theirs. How do I stack up? And recent studies have shown that actually the more time people spend browsing on Facebook instead of creating original content to post, the more they feel envious and the more they feel down on themselves. But really, when you can consider what do people actually post on Facebook, they post the good stuff, right? There are people who will complain on Facebook, but they're always going to be the people who complain. But for the rest of the population, most people are putting things like their achievements on there or occasions to celebrate. And so we're getting this skewed view of what other people's lives are like. And you don't have to be on social media. I don't want to exclude anyone. So you don't have to be on social media to do that, because I find that, when I run into other people my age and I hear that they own their own business or they own their own homes, I find myself playing the comparison game. But the good news is that we are not alone. In our gospel reading today, we see that even the disciples did this. Now, Jesus had just finished telling them that he was going to be betrayed and killed, and then on the third day rise again, and it's like it just went whoosh, right over their heads, because they set off for their next destination, and the next thing you know, they're having an argument about which one of them is the greatest. And I don't know if Jesus just, pretended not to hear, or if he really didn't hear, but, he's God, so, he just knew. But he asked them, he called them out on their status seeking. He said, "What were you arguing about on the way?" And they are silent. So the next thing he does is he sits down, which is the posture that a rabbi would take when he was about to teach. And he simply says, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." And then from what he does next, we can reasonably conclude that the purpose for their argument was not just to determine who was greatest, but it was also to decide who among them was the best stand-in for Jesus. Who could speak for him? Who could take his place? And as they're in this house, there are likely children running around, there were servants milling about. Jesus takes one of these children and lifts it up in his arms. And he says, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." And basically what he's saying is that the most appropriate stand-in for him is someone with no social standing whatsoever. And that's kind of hard for us to wrap our minds around because of the value that our culture places on children. But in Jesus' time, children were thought to be the lowest in the household, even lower in status than household slaves. And so according to Jesus, if we want to be great in this life, we've got to relinquish any claims to status and become servants to all. And so not only does that clash with our tendency and our desire for upward mobility, but it actually calls us to just the opposite. Unlike all the advertisements, all the news, all the graduation speeches you're going to hear, Jesus doesn't call us to make something of ourselves. He calls us to a way of downward mobility. And so if you want an excellent picture of this, downward mobility is what Jesus embodies in the 13th chapter of John. Now, we were asked to preach on our favorite Bible stories this summer, and John 13 is probably one of my top ones. But the disciples, they were gathered together with Jesus. They were eating together. And during supper, Jesus got up and he took off his outer garments. And he tied a towel around his waist. And he took water and poured it into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet, wiping them with the towel that was tied around him. And so in Jesus' time, if it wasn't the individual, him or herself, that washed their feet as they entered a house, it was a household slave, and it was usually the lowest ranking household slave. So when Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter said, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus said, "You don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will." And Peter protested and he says, "No, you will never wash my feet." But Jesus replied, "Unless I wash you, you won't belong to me." And so after this dialogue continues, Peter finally yields to Jesus and allows him to wash his feet. And after washing their feet, Jesus puts his robe back on and he sits down again and he asks them, "Do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, because that is who I am. And if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet." Now, here's the thing that always gets me about this story. For those of us who grew up in church, or for those of us who've heard it, more than just a couple times, I think it's really easy for us to imagine Jesus the man doing this, washing the disciples' feet, or perhaps even washing our own feet. But when we consider that Jesus was not just 100% human, but also 100% God, I think that's harder, because it's the God we sing to, and the God we pray to, and the God we describe with words like omnipotent and everlasting and holy. That God bent low and washed the tired, dirty, calloused feet of people like you and me. What grace! What love! And there are a lot of churches that reenact this story from John's Gospel during worship on Maundy Thursday, which is the night before Good Friday. And for centuries, they've been doing this in Vatican City, where the Pope would gather with the priests in either St. John Lateran or St. Peter's Basilica, and he would wash the feet of 12 priests, each one representing one of the 12 disciples. But all of that changed last year when the newly elected Pope Francis broke with tradition, and instead he held the Maundy Thursday Mass in a juvenile detention center. He washed the feet of 12 prisoners, including the feet of 2 Muslims and 2 women. And the Pope is arguably the most widely known, most revered, most respected leader in the Christian church. And yet he gave up the comfortable palatial confines of the Vatican property and chose a prison instead. Now, in general, when we hear Jesus' call to imitate him in this way, I don't think he actually literally meant for us to go around washing other people's feet. But what I think the Pope communicated in his choice of venue is something that Jesus was trying to teach his disciples and us about the posture of discipleship. And that's that disciples don't stay where they are, where they're comfortable. And also, we shouldn't be reaching up for the next rung on the social ladder, the career ladder, for the economic ladder. We shouldn't be reaching for the stars like every single graduation card out there apparently says, discovered this year. Instead of reaching for these things, we should bend low and reach for a towel. Reach down instead of up. Now, in a world that's been telling us that the only way to go is up, you might say, that's absurd. And you wouldn't be wrong. That's what I think Paul was trying to communicate in his letter to the Corinthians. The way Paul sees it, the central message of the gospel is Christ crucified. And that there had never been anything more alien or more foolish sounding to the culture of that time. So many of us now wear the cross as an object. We place it at the center of our places of worship. And so it's become so familiar to us that sometimes it's difficult to think of what it was, an instrument of torture. In Jesus' time, it was the ultimate symbol of shame, humiliation, and rejection. And so the Corinthians, who valued status and who valued influence in a lot of the same ways that we do, to them, the idea that redemption could come through someone's crucifixion, that was absurd. It was ludicrous. And yet Paul says that in the death and resurrection of Christ, we see the very power and wisdom of God. It's in weakness, and it's in something that ultimately looked like a failure that God uses to transform us and to renew the world. So God's ways stand in stark contrast to what the world says is wise and the way the world defines success. And when Jesus says, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me," basically he's saying, make that your way too. Let your life be defined by humility and self-giving love, these things that appear foolish in the eyes of the world, and make it your aim to become servant of all. That's the way you become great. And that's radically different than any message we ever heard in school, any message we hear when we turn on the TV, and probably most messages we'll hear from our friends and our family. Henri Nouwen, he's one of the people who's done some of the most writing on Jesus' call to downward mobility. And he was, in the height of his career, a very well sought after speaker. He was a professor at Yale. He had been a professor at Harvard and Notre Dame. And at what people thought was the height of his career, he chose to leave it all behind and go and live in a community called L'Arche, which stands for the Ark. And it was a community for people with profound disabilities, where people without disabilities would live alongside them in community. And so his colleagues, his friends, they were polite enough not to say, "Are you an idiot?" But when he did get invited to the White House during the Clinton administration to be the personal chaplain to Bill and Hillary Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, he turned it down. And people said to him, "Wow, what an honor. How could you turn something like that down?" But he knew that Jesus' way is the way of downward mobility. And so I think the question for us is, what does that look like for us? We're not all Henri Nouwen. But if upward mobility has us climbing the career ladder, does it mean then that we have to quit our jobs or decline a promotion? Maybe. Maybe not. When Jesus was calling the disciples, he called Levi, who was a tax collector, and he called him out of his tax booth. I think in part because his trade would also not allow him to live in faithful obedience to Christ. But on the other hand, Jesus didn't give up his role or his influence as a rabbi. He couldn't give up his fame once people figured out that he could heal people. And he certainly didn't give up his identity as the Son of God. But what's important to point out in Jesus is that his status and his identity were of no consideration to him whatsoever. Now, I know we've got a lot of students here today, and so I'm imagining that some of you are hearing this and saying, "Well, does that mean I don't have to go to college?" Sorry, parents. Or does it mean that, if I'm in school, in graduate school, that I should drop out? Well, maybe, but maybe not. Because education can be an extremely valuable tool that allows us to serve people with some pretty complex needs. And I think what it comes down to, the bottom line is, what's my motivation? Am I being driven by some culturally construed pressure to succeed or to build my resume? Or is what's driving me a desire to follow in the footsteps of Christ? So in the end, I think Christ's call to downward mobility invites all of us to do two things. The first is for us to make a radical shift in the way we define success. And not in the way that the world defines it, but in the way that Jesus defined it. If we want to be great, we've got to be last of all. We've got to make ourselves servant of all. And by all, I don't think Jesus was just saying your friends, your family, the people you like, the people it's comfortable to serve. But I think he was also talking about the people that often our society relegates to the bottom of the social ladder: the poor, the mentally ill, those with profound disabilities, the incarcerated, the dying, those struggling with addiction. The second thing I think it invites us to do is to ask ourselves this question. I think we can ask ourselves this every day, probably multiple times a day. How can I be more of a servant today than I was yesterday? Throughout Jesus' ministry, it became clear that his singular focus was the cross, to give himself for the world. And so when he calls us to take up our cross and follow, he is calling us to that exact same thing, to give ourselves for the world. And that may lead us to make decisions that look pretty foolish, maybe even that look like failure. But in that supreme act of self-giving love was God's power to transform us and to transform the world. And I think that's what's at stake in our own lives too. When we recognize how much we've been loved, and when we recognize how much grace we've received, and then when we in turn give ourselves over to the way of humility, the way of service, the way of self-giving love, that's where the power of God is. And that's what God is going to use to transform us, to transform our communities, and ultimately to transform the world. Amen? Amen.